here. It was Elaine Bernez, who is a longtime resident of Toxlunk, which is down the road here, and knew a lot of the stories of the era that I wrote about, who encouraged me to write something up because she knew that I knew a person that had been part of the Mount Vernon Unitarian Church when I was a minister there, and had actually written her eulogy for her memorial service, and had found out some fascinating parts of her own life story that sort of wove together with Elaine's interest in what was happening in Fairfax County, especially southern Fairfax County in the 1960s around the area of social justice. That it was sort of a county that was beginning to wake up to the fact that there were a lot of human rights issues going on. There was the civil rights issue, there was fair housing, there was, you alluded to the question of the Loving suit about having interracial marriages, and that it was so interesting to learn the stories of how folks in this community, so the Fort Hunt Corridor kind of got involved with some of these issues to bring things to the forefront, because a lot of people think of Fairfax County as kind of being this, staid, suburban, formerly rural and then suburban area. But there were some real activists that got going, probably out of the Holland Hills and Toxmont community. So I wrote a few of the events that were happening in the 1960s connected with the Mount Vernon Unitarian Church, especially the story, the most fascinating story, which got Elaine thinking about, and she put this in here.
Did you tell about Selma?
Yeah, Judy Street was a member of our church, a housewife with kids, and when she heard about the Martin Luther King cry to get people to come to Selma, to walk with the folks that were working for voting rights in Selma, she heard about it. Most of the Unitarian ministers in our area went down there, and she decided she wanted to go too.
Did you say that there had been a murder before that?
Right, well, right. Actually, there had been some, obviously there was a lot of violence, a lot of murders, and the walk that she was on was, in fact, when 3 people were murdered that had gone down to the walk, one of them a Unitarian minister. And so her story is, I think, a very fascinating story about how she had the courage of her convictions to leave her husband with little kids and take a sleeping bag and go down and not knowing what was going to happen and putting herself at risk to walk with people to try to get them voting rights. The other thing that, thinking about these books, is that these stories, is that there were so many other stories that came to my mind because I lived in this area. I moved here in 1980. That's when you said you moved here. And my kids were being brought up here, and the Unitarian Church, Mount Vernon Unitarian Church, which is right down the way, has quite a bit of history that goes back to the pre-revolutionary time, really. And so my youngest daughter was doing some research when she was a teenager and decided to focus on what was really going on around our area, because we have a lot of stories that are some of them anecdotal, of George Mason, George Washington, and all that. And so we went to the Virginia Room, and we learned all these stories about the importance of the Quaker community that came down here in the 1840s. And that, I noticed that's not in here, but you may not know, this part of the county was, during the Civil War, was a neutral area because the Quakers were here, and so they owned a lot of the land that had been, and they paid African Americans that had been freed by George Washington, and they paid them to work with them, and so they were, in a sense, the beginning of civil rights, and they were pacifists, and so they declared that anybody, whether they were a soldier from the South or a soldier from the North, could come and rest in this part of the county. And learning this stuff in the Virginia Room was fascinating, and I'd love to get that story in here, that we had a part in that. This part of Fairfax County did anyway. Elaine Bernez has many, many, many stories, and she has a lot of files of records of the work for housing rights, so that the communities around here would not be quote unquote redlined, that people would make the intention to, yes, allow for there to be people of different races and immigrant groups to be able to live in their neighborhoods and not worry about that it was going to lower their house value. That if they signed on to make the commitment, and so they actually moved towards the Fair Housing Act, which was passed in the 60s, which is a huge piece of federal legislation, came out of people here in southern Fairfax County, and the Judy Streets, you know, that's one woman's story that was reflected by others, but it's so important.